Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our annual CMMC Summit, which we are proud to co-host with Amazon Web Services. With nearly 2,500 organizations represented here in the summit today, from defense, higher education, and international sectors, the timing couldn't be more critical. On December 16th, 2024, CMMC will become reality, and by mid-2025, these requirements will appear in contracts. So this isn't just another compliance milestone. Today's summit represents a fundamental shift in how we protect our nation's sensitive information within the defense industrial base. I am going to kick off this compliance summit, however, with a discussion on cybersecurity. Understandably, many organizations are approaching CMMC with a narrower focus on compliance, treating it as a contractual requirement. And while compliance is necessary, I submit that it shouldn't be our North Star. Consider this. When we equip our warfighters, we don't aim for minimum specifications, we demand excellence because lives depend on it. The same principle ought to apply to protecting controlled unclassified information. Just as we provide our warfighters with the very best possible equipment without making it more complex to use, we believe achieving the highest levels of cybersecurity should be as straightforward as basic compliance. In today's threat landscape, securing sensitive data is as crucial as securing physical assets. The DIB doesn't need compliance, it needs security that matches the sophistication of modern threats. The good news is that with the right approach, excellence in security comes naturally, with compliance, without additional complexity or burden. And I'd submit that this isn't just about national security. Great cybersecurity is also sound business. The average cost of a data breach now exceeds millions, and in the defense industrial base, the impact extends beyond financial losses to national security implications. True security isn't a compliance checkbox, it's a strategic imperative for both business continuity and national defense. Prevail's journey began with a fundamental recognition in today's world that breaches are inevitable. This reality shaped our core principle, which is building systems that remain secure even when breaches occur. We were born out of MIT's advanced cryptographic research and embrace the same security principles that protect the world's most sensitive communications. By implementing true end-to-end encryption and eliminating central points of vulnerability, we have created an architecture where even a full system compromise can't expose protected data. Our approach means that when you achieve compliance with Prevail, you're not just meeting requirements, you're implementing the highest grade of security available today as naturally as using any standard business tool. Our unwavering commitment to security excellence drives our core mission for CMMC, which is making compliance truly accessible by systematically reducing both the complexity and, most importantly, the cost of compliance. We now work with about 1,500 customers, most, arguably the majority of them, small and medium-sized businesses. And we have witnessed how relentless focus on simplification transforms their compliance journey. The defense industrial base's strength lies in its diversity, from small, innovative manufacturers to large defense contractors. And we believe protecting this diversity means making world-class security and compliance attainable for everyone. That's why we continuously innovate to reduce the compliance burden, streamlining processes, eliminating unnecessary complexity, and focusing on dramatic cost reductions. And I'm glad to report that in the past year, it has been demonstrated with over a dozen CMMC assessments. Our customers have now achieved a perfect 110 out of 100 scores, saving six figures on average, and proving the world-class security can be both straightforward and affordable for businesses of any size. We've also learned that documentation is one of the most time-consuming and expensive aspects of CMMC compliance and often costs hundreds of thousands of dollars. And that's why we have worked closely with C3PAOs to develop and vet detailed documentation that organizations can adopt and customize, eliminating the need to start from zero. This pre-vetted documentation dramatically streamlines the assessment process and can save organization months of efforts and tens to hundreds of thousands in documentation costs. With all that said, the goal of today's summit reflects our commitment to objective and impartial education about CMMC compliance. And we are honored, therefore, to begin with a keynote from Robert Metzger, arguably one of the nation's preeminent experts in federal compliance and cybersecurity law. And as a partner at Rogers Joseph O'Donnell and co-chair of their cybersecurity and privacy practice group, Bob's recognition as a Federal 100 awardee and his work on cyber supply chain defense science board make him uniquely qualified to guide us through exactly what is the CMMC regulation. And I'd be remiss in adding that in today's era, the most important credential Bob has is that if you ask ChatGPT, who are the top 10 compliance lawyers in the country, Bob is number one. So therefore, you have it. So throughout the day, you'll hear directly from C3PAOs, prime contractors, consultants, and even the author of the NIST 800-171 standard. We have structured intimate breakout sessions where you can engage directly with assessors and experts, ensuring your specific questions and concerns are addressed. And finally, we extend our sincere appreciation to all our sponsors, and particularly Amazon Web Services, Neo Systems, Nectar, Prescient, and Synergex. You'll find them and meet with them throughout the day in sponsors' booths. And with that, thank you again for joining, and let's begin this important conversation with our keynote speaker, Bob Metzger.
So I want to emphasize initially my appreciation to be here, and my thanks to those of you who have taken the time to join this program. And I am speaking for myself. I'm going to start kind of talking the basics. What is CMMC? Well, it stands for Cyber Security Maturity Model Certification. It's a compliance framework, and it applies to organizations that have contracts with the Department of Defense. It has several tiers. There are 3 levels. As many as 220,000 companies are subject to any of the 3. We are going to focus on the middle level. It's level 2, and that concerns companies who host, process, or transmit controlled unclassified information. That CUI is a form of information which the federal government must protect by reason of law, regulation, or government-wide policy. And obviously, it is unclassified information, but DoD has made the judgment some years ago that it's vitally important to protect sensitive but unclassified information, specifically CUI. And that's because there has been years of painful experience where nation states, especially China, have exfiltrated or stolen, as a form of industrial espionage, huge amounts of unclassified but sensitive information which they have used to diminish our potential advantage in should a conflict occur, and to seek to meet, rival, or exceed some of our capabilities using our technology. Level 2 has broad impact. It's going to apply, according to DoD, to 80,000 companies. And 90% of those companies have to pass something called a certification assessment, which is going to be done by a C3PAO, certified third-party assessment organization. Now, this isn't, we're not in the land anymore where you get to check yourself and report your own score. It is implemented by contract, and the operative clause is one probably all of you have seen before, and that's DFARS 252-204-7012. It goes back to about 2015, but the first time it actually imposed obligations to adequately safeguard CUI was on December 31st, 2017. And that's a date worth keeping in mind because DoD is somewhat impatient, maybe more than somewhat. Thinking that companies have been taking this contractual obligation for years, but really haven't succeeded in achieving enough protection of CUI. Now, adequate security is accomplished by reference to a publication of the National Institute of Standards and Technology, SP 800-171. And specifically, CMMC relies upon 110 cyber controls that exist in 14 security families. And it's worth a look at this basic rule because at the core level, the 171 requirements are easily understandable. They are originally expressed in just a single sentence each. However, as the program and as compliance has evolved, and as we move into CMMC, there are layers of additional documentation intended to advise companies on how to understand and apply these cyber controls, as well as advise assessors and companies of what must be considered to determine whether a CMMC assessment will be satisfied. And specifically, there are now 320 discrete assessment objectives that are described in a companion document, SP 800-171A, which is the assessment guide that NIST prepared. And in addition, there is for CMMC an evolution of 171A, which is a CMMC Level 2 assessment guide. And it distills ultimately in the assessment whether a requirement is met or not applicable. And if requirements are not met and the necessary scores are not achieved, then you will not pass the certification assessment. And this has unfortunate consequences for your eligibility for DoD contracts. CMMC is fundamentally a compliance requirement. A lot of us have watched this program and wondered and waited seemingly forever, and we have become perhaps numb to the endurance required for the rulemaking process. Things have changed. The CMMC program rule, 32 CFR Part 170, is now final. The final document was published on October 15th, or 16th rather, and the rule becomes effective after 60 days on December 16th. There's a companion rule that is the contractual implementation of the program rule. That contract rule at 48 CFR was out for comment until October 15th, and we can expect that the contract rule will be final along with the program rule by the end of the second quarter of 2025, maybe sooner. The fact that we have the final program rule, which tells DoD how to operate CMMC and tells contractors what DoD will expect, is very significant, and it's something that merits the attention of every company that's here. Now, here I've drawn from a number of DoD slides that are available at the link that's on the bottom right. I understand that you'll have the opportunity to take these slides. I want to mention also that at the very back is a kind of chronology slide, which has a series of active links that will help you kind of look at key documentation. Well, there's a long gestation here. And one of the common themes of the gestation is that, first, it begins with this legal obligation on the part of the government to protect CUI that the Department of Defense has decided to extend to its contractors with whom it shares CUI. They have the contractual right to do this, and it reflects an underlying legal duty on DoD's parts. DoD tried an approach that was one of essentially voluntary compliance. In other words, companies took the 7012 clause that said they would deliver adequate security and follow 171. And the first time that this was supposed to be accomplished, as I mentioned, was back at the end of December in 2017. So we went through a period of years in which companies were essentially trusted to kind of attest as to their own compliance. And there was no verification of that compliance, and it didn't work. There have been indicators for years of continued, if not increasing, exfiltration of valuable information. A DoD-IG report in 2019 that showed that the DIB was largely non-compliant. And then something happened that was critical in 2020. That was the enactment of Section 1648 of the National Defense Authorization Act, which is the statutory basis for the 32 CFR program rule and the upcoming 48 CFR contract rule. Now, this is another chart, again, from the DoD slides. You can see there are 3 levels. And the first level is for federal contract information. We're not going to worry about that today. The second level is for CUI. That's the one with 110 requirements. And fundamentally, it requires that companies who have the contract clause, 7021, that invokes the CMMC assessment obligation, have to pass that assessment every 3 years, and they have to add an annual affirmation by a senior official. So this is not just a kind of one-time check this and ignore it obligation. It's a continuing obligation. Now, level 3 is harder stuff, imposing 24 additional requirements. It has a much smaller number of companies will be affected. We won't talk about that today. As of the latest or the final 32 CFR rule, we see that DoD has a 4-year implementation plan, but no one should think that the finality of the rule doesn't affect them. And you shouldn't be lulled into the notion that this won't get to you until later. And while it might, for some of you, arrive at year 2 or 3 or even 4, the problem for most contractors is that you won't know in advance when it will come to you or when your prime will demand that you show you're ready for certification assessment. And most companies find that it takes 6 to perhaps 18 months to be sure you're ready, that you'll pass the assessment. So you got to kind of get started now. DoD's view is that companies that haven't started are already late. Now you can see the rollout, is gradual, but fairly intense, taken as a whole. Just 135 assessments in that first year, which will start around, somewhere between March and June of next year. And that's not that many, but part of the reason for the limitation is DoD is going to focus on getting the implementation resources, namely these assessors, and making sure that companies are, understand the requirements and are beginning to voluntarily get assessments, even if they are not required. By the start of the 4th year, that is after 3 full years, DoD's intention in that 4th year is that every solicitation and contract is going to include an applicable CMMC level requirement. And what that means is that you're not going to get an option renewed. You will not be able to get an award of a contract with the requirement unless you have passed the certification assessment obligation. And that's not necessarily, should not be assumed. It must be accomplished. So this is a chart that I put together, drawing from the final 32 CFR rule. And let's look at the kind of center bracket there. This is the group of level 2 for CUI, C3PAO assessments, third-party assessment organizations, independent bodies that you hire to do an assessment. And it says that 76,598 companies are going to require this assessment over, I think, a 7-year period. That's a lot. And of those, a substantial fraction is small. But the key point here is that self-assessment is allowed for maybe 5% or less than 5%, about 5% of the companies subject to level 2. But most companies that have CUI, as evident from this chart, which is drawn from the regulations, should expect that they will be subject to this C3PAO assessment, whether or not they are small or big. Now, over in the left block, I've put a number of things that serve to remind us that the applicability is quite broad. This does apply to small businesses and to commercial products. Pure COTS is excluded. Universities who have expressed some hesitation about this program are excluded only if they are engaged solely in fundamental research without either federal contract information or CUI. Flowdown is explicitly required throughout the supply chain at all tiers. The CMMC applies to international primes, and according to the words of the rule, and to subs regardless of where they operate. The certification lasts only 3 years. I mentioned annual affirmations. And for those of you who might hope that there might be an easy way to get waivers, the rule is pretty clear that waivers are not something that can be asked for by contractors. Waiver authority is limited. And right now, we can expect it to be concentrated in high-level officials. It won't be impossible, but it never should be assumed. And there is no safety valve for companies, however well explained, that don't think they can do it. Now, Sanjeev had asked that I put together 5 takeaways from the final rule. I've managed to do in 10. These are all significant. The most important thing is that DoD is committed to the CMMC program. There's been a lot of question, doubt, and hesitation over the 7 to 9 years that this thing has evolved. But they decided to do it. And in order to produce the final 32 CFR Part 170 program rule, it was necessary for the DoD CIO office, the author of this rule, to coordinate with many other organizations within the department, as well as organizations within the broader executive branch national security community, and to go through interagency review and careful consideration by the Office of Management and Budget. So this was not an easy drive for the authors of the rule. And DoD has gotten the rule finalized, meaning that the executive branch is behind it. A second key point is that the rule is threat-driven. We wouldn't have this if we were not in a difficult geopolitical time with a worsening threat environment. Also, this rule follows recognition that self-attestation or trust that companies would do as they said had not succeeded. It's important to protect CUI, and CMMC is an enforcement mechanism that imposes verification obligations and requirements that existed before and apart from CMMC. Before, under the earlier present regime, companies could submit a low self-assessment score, promising to close gaps over some period of time and essentially rest on those low scores, even if they were minus numbers as opposed to a 100% score. You can't do that any longer, because once the assessment requirement shows up in a contract clause, well, your ability to accept yourself by promising to close gaps and sin no more, it won't exist. If you don't meet the demanding standards of the CMMC third-party assessment, you will be ineligible for award. DoD got a lot of input that it should make it easier for small businesses, and it decided that the need to, or necessity to, protect sensitive but unclassified information applies, equally to companies regardless of size. And so there's no special relief in this final 32 CFR for small businesses. DoD has also made it quite clear that it's accepting the Rev 2 171 controls, which themselves have about a 7-year history. Those are the present baseline, but the baseline will move. And DoD has said that it expects by future rulemaking to move the baseline to the more demanding requirements of the of Revision 3 to SP 800-171, which is already, in being. It is important to appreciate that the final 32 CFR rule does facilitate the use of enclaves for security and managed service providers. This was a notable change from the proposed rule. And what this means is that there are going to be a lot of choices for many sources of innovation or ways in which companies can satisfy this rule. It should never be assumed that the lowest cost, simplest answer will be the one that is sufficient to get compliance, but you'll at least have the opportunity to consider various strategies and methods. We also have to expect that prime contractors will put the pressure on their suppliers quickly. Prime contractors are responsible for the CMMC compliance of their subs. And if, in a situation where you have a carefully knit supply chain in support of a DoD prime contract, the primes don't want to find out at or near the time of their award, or at or near the time they intend to or must make the award to the sub, that the sub doesn't qualify. Because that essentially produces a disruption or break in the supply chain, which they're not going to want to risk. And so you can expect even now to see prime contractors, asking for demonstration sooner rather than later that companies have passed or will pass the certification assessment. I mentioned that the proposed 48 CFR rule, which is the contract rule, was put out for comment, and the comment period closed on October 15. And those of you who can look at these slides later can appreciate these are just some of the details, but here are some key things. Now, the 48 CFR rule as proposed says that companies have to notify DoD of any lapses or changes to their information system or when CMMC compliance status changes. This suggests a kind of continuing obligation to monitor, and it would impose a continuing obligation to report And as a business matter, what this means is that companies should figure this isn't a one-time or non-recurring investment. There will be some one-time or special charges, but this is an obligation to improve your security, to be compliant, to pass that assessment, and then to continue to be compliant and be able to show it. And DoD recognizes explicitly that companies are going to have to change their business plans or make the business case work for these continuing obligations. And DoD says that, yes, these are obligations that we impose, but we impose them not only for our benefit, but also the benefit that businesses will receive by having higher security. And they are not going to pay as direct cost the new charges for CMMC Level 2 compliance. For Level 3, you're likely to get paid for the direct cost of the more difficult additional 24 requirements. So I'll close out with this slide. It's pretty simple. CMMC is real and it's now. Compliance, as well as security, not always the same, serve both enterprise and the national interest. Security is not going to be free. It comes at a cost. That cost is independent of CMMC, although some of the costs are specific to demonstrating compliance according to the NIST standard. The costs are going to continue and they need to be figured in your enterprise plans. And I describe this as the new reality. And it's true whether you do business for DoD or otherwise. Almost any company has already found that the cyber threats are not only out there, but exist as risks to them, a reality. So the reality is that you're thinking about your business needs to contemplate, plan for those costs and provision the resources, financial, technical, and human to get the job done. You'll have choices for security systems. I cannot emphasize enough that waiting and watching is bad business. Perhaps you're ready to go already, but many companies, most at least in my informal assessment, will need 6 to 18 months to be highly confident they're ready to pass a certification assessment. You don't want to get a solicitation or a contract mod with a CMMC certification requirement and find that you must be certified within 6 months of receiving the RFP, but you need 18 to get it done. I want to finally say that there's an advantage to getting underway already. DoD has said that Level 2 CMMC certification assessments can be conducted after the effective date of this new 32 CFR rule. That's December 16th, and these count. And you, as a business, will find an advantage in early achievement of that assessment. It'll give you several years of coverage where you can show the prime or the government that you're ready. It'll be a positive, competitive discriminator. I do want to emphasize that those of you who have relied upon plans of action and milestones as a way to postpone compliance by having gaps to be fulfilled later, that's just not going to work when the rule becomes final. And, this is not quite existential, but highly important to those of you who value DoD business, because DoD cannot make it more clear that most of the Level 2 companies, 95% of them or so, are not going to be able to take DoD contracts, which have that 7021 clause CMMC assessment requirement, unless they have passed that assessment. And the bar is set quite high. And with that, I'll stop. I thank everybody for their interest. Sorry that my video has acted up, but I hope this has been a useful audio presentation for your listening.